thank you very much. And sorry you have to deal with me a second time, but Stephanie, I was on a Zoom with her this morning. She can't talk right now. She came home from a trip and is actually really sick. So on the other hand, I would point out she came, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago to join our center, and she has made an enormous difference in that she actually started to work on creating frameworks of how do we actually handle carbon management? How do we manage the carbon? How do we balance things? So if I can step back a little and lay out that framework, which has its roots probably 20, 30 years ago, but there are several separate strands. The first one is we very clearly in our framework separate between greenhouse gases and broad sense climate impacts and the carbon problem as a specific subset, and not even just a subset, it's also going into ocean acidification. So as a separate, distinct problem, we want to balance the carbon budget. So we are not looking in this discussion what happens to NOx or methane, except methane is a carbon atom, but we don't give you that factor 25. So this is our starting point. So we want to do exact carbon accounting, and that means we have to certify that carbon has been put away, because in the end, we need to get to a net zero balance. On the one side, carbon is coming into the environment or came into the environment. On the other side, we have to put it away, and we need to certify that that's what's done correctly. So we have a basic principle. We say there's a reservoir. You have to define your sink, and you have to tell us that the sink is there and can be delineated, and you know what you're putting into it. You can measure what you're putting into it. We are very much pointing out it has to be quantitative. And then beyond just measuring what we put in, we also want to measure that it's still there. And you could have temporary storage by design or by accident. And then the point is, when it's lost, well, then it's lost, and we need to do something about it, because we made a promise up front that we are balancing the carbon emission, which means we do it on a climate relevant time scale, which is on the order of 10,000 years. So if we take it from that perspective, we can certify all of these things. So we are talking a lot about monitoring and verification, and one of the big efforts which is going on, how do we do this to 25 different ways of doing it? How do we get a certificate of sequestration which is equally good for forestry as it is for mineralization or geological storage? We need to have all of these things worked out, and we are deeply into looking at different examples and try out these. Beyond that, we also want to what Stephanie called fit for purpose. Basically, it's not good enough that I can remove a lot of carbon if I do more damage on other aspects of the environment or in social impacts on communities. So whatever we allow as a sequestration certificate must also be fit for purpose in this regard. Lastly, who is responsible if the carbon is lost? And we argue the responsibility for this carbon naturally lies on the storage operator, because the storage operator is the one who knows where it is. Think about it very simply. I bought a gallon of gasoline, I filled up my car. Do I really want to check every 5 years that my carbon is still stored? That's not my job in a way. And ultimately, the group who knows, the institution who knows, is the storage operator who has it and may have lost it. Now, how does the storage operator remedy it? By buying a new certificate. Right? So I, who bought the original certificate at the gas station, am out of the loop. Now, the question is, am I the right person to buy this? So the second big question is, where do you apply these ideas of sequestration? And we came down very strongly on the side, and we were actually there before the carbon takeback obligation, because in already 2000 we were saying that. The idea is the responsibility lies with the extractor. So I extract carbon and I pass that to a storage operator, and I want to see a certificate of sequestration, not when this has worked its way through the entire economy and comes out as a tailpipe, but right at the moment it came out of the ground. For some reason, it's just very practical, because this is the place where we know that it is. The last time we really know where it is, which got us then into a big argument and fight. We like LCA, life cycle analysis, from the perspective that I qualitatively need to know what I'm doing. It better not be stupid. Right? But on the other hand, life cycle analysis is a nearly impossible task to quantify in accounting. In other words, if you ask me, I'm a baker, I'm just ran this oven and I made a loaf of bread. It is nearly impossible for me to figure out how much carbon was involved in this. Where did my electricity really come from, right? How much was involved in all of these steps? So we are saying LCA, you need to do because you need to understand what you're doing, but it is not an accounting tool. And if you rolled it all the way up to the point it came out of the ground, I actually don't need to do that because I cleared all carbon the moment it came out of the ground, and it now can go through the system. And we recently wrote a paper where we argued this is very nice in the long term because I don't really have to prove to you that you are counterproductive with your storage, because let's face it, in your life cycle analysis, you should have figured out that you're emitting more carbon than you put out. We call that counterproductive storage, right? We don't need to prove this to you because you go bankrupt. If in your supply chain are 2 certificates of sequestration, you can't possibly make money selling 1 certificate. Right? So we don't have to worry about it, but you do have to worry about it in the transition phase. Because when you start it, we may only get 10% of the carbon taken care of that way. Then if I have a technology which is 9 times counterproductive, I actually can get away with it. And we first thought, okay, we can maybe just accommodate that, but you can't because people will actively search this out and try to skim money out of the system. So we have to figure out how to get around it. And what we pointed out, I wrote a paper 2000 actually, which said we need permits. So you not just have a certificate of sequestration because we don't have enough, but you also need a permit for the rest of the carbon. And we can actually prove that in that way, you can never cheat because the permit cost will guarantee that a counterproductive way of doing it cannot actually operate. And so we actually think ultimately, we need to go even one step further and say the liability for the carbon is on the extractor from today on out, as soon as we can put it there. And then these permits will cover this partially, but ultimately you will need futures for carbon where your promise that it's eventually put away has to be dealt with. This is sort of where it closes and comes back to where it was the last time. And I thank you for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Klaus. I know that Walter has a question, and we're going to also bring up Ritwik, who's one of our social science fellows and focused on carbon markets. I think it's a very relevant interface. So Walter, mic is yours.
Thank you, Klaus. I have all kinds of great questions, but I'll bug you after. But the question I have is about the permits part, because a lot of the discussion assumes that 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2. But what about the CO2 that aviation emits 30,000 feet already above the ground compared to the CO2 that other sources perhaps emit? And the other part was, I think, some of the discussion that we had yesterday about, well, is the credits that you will get for sequestration the same if you do monoculture compared to if you do other things?
We would, to answer your first question, the air mixes pretty darn well. So yes, for a few days, you may tell that there's excess CO2 high up rather than low down. But as a rough rule of thumb, in about 2-3 weeks, the air has moved along a longitude around the planet. In about 6 months, it has mixed on the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, whichever was your source. And in about a couple of years, you actually have mixed across the 2 hemispheres. So I would not worry about that. We are in a way radical on your second question, in that we're saying we are accounting for carbon. And there's nothing wrong with selling a certificate of sequestration, which you get, pick a number, $50 for, because you put carbon away, and say, oh, by the way, this carbon certificate also saves the rainforest. And are you willing to pay more for that rainforest attribute? That's perfectly fine. But I think you get into a very messy situation when you say, look, all the good things we did, because then the corollary always is, and now don't look so hard on what you really did with the carbon, because I was so good on the other side. So we would like to cleanly separate these things. But then we have this last hook, which is the fit for purpose, right? If you tell me that you make monoplantations, we may come to an agreement societally that that is a really lousy idea. Yeah. And therefore you are not allowed to do that as carbon storage. right? But it is not something where we would say, well, it didn't store carbon. Yes, it did store carbon, and we could certify that. But I can also come up with a whole lot of other bad ways of storing carbon, which you really do not want to do. And this is where we have ultimately this is a societal agreement, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But we do want to say that if you buy a certificate of sequestration, you don't really need to know what's under the hood, because it guarantees that carbon has been put away and somebody is indefinitely responsible for that carbon being put away. If you want to pay for additional attributes and you're paying a bonus for that, that's fine, but let's not mingle these things and think of them as two separate things. Does that make sense?
Thank you, Klaus. That is so helpful. And I think brand really matters. We've seen some of the best known and best recognized brands in the carbon markets, Vera, Gold Standard, called out in the press. So brand matters. But
it's not just brand, because it is so complicated. It is human nature to take advantage of these of the wriggliness in there. For example, one of the things we rail against is counterfactual baselines, right? If you tell me the forest would be this big, well, how do I know it would be that big? And then we have endless discussion. Was it additive? Would it have done that anyhow, or wouldn't it have done? We say, here's a box, there's carbon in it. And to give you an example, this building has a lot of wood in it. You could decide that you want to call that stored. In our system, we wouldn't worry about additionality, but what we would tell you, if you didn't do that and the building burns down, you're fine. If you do it, well, you're not fine, but you don't have a carbon liability, right? But if you do it, you are now in perpetuity responsible for that carbon. So if something happens to this building in 50 years from now, you are responsible to transfer that carbon liability to somebody else. But you didn't have to engage in this discussion in the first place. And you could say, this is biocarbon, I don't really care about it. It can stay where it is, and then we are fine. But if you draw a box around it and say, I put the carbon there, then you are responsible for it. And this responsibility doesn't end in 100 years. It is on a scientific timescale, which you can only get with scientific consensus. In 10,000 years from now, we still have the carbon, or you give me a chain, how you got from A to B.
Thank you, Klaus. That's so helpful.